Hello, everybody.
Hi.
Hey, still sun shining there?
Yeah.
But it's a little cold. It's a little cold here. 24 degrees.
Oh. Hmm. 34. How about 2? Or actually now -1. So it's going down.
No.
And we had some rain this morning, but it came down and was frozen upon contact. So we had skating surface, ice surface everywhere. But that's gone. It melted. Okay, it's been some weeks since I was with you, and many things have happened since then, I'm sure. So, and now we're in the subject of pest control, and that sort of thing. So, what I was planning on doing today was covering some basic biological features of what's a pest and how pests are controlled, or how anything is controlled naturally. So why the population of something doesn't go up, up, up all the time. You know, there's limits, but mostly focusing on natural enemies. So, predators and parasites and diseases like this that keep populations under control in nature. And so in farming, you have to be a good student of nature. And so I think I was wondering if you have any experience on your own work and your own activity in your farming and growing of things, observing anything that seems to be helping by removing pests. Have you seen anything like that? Or any evidence that something like that is going on? You know, you were concerned about something one day and then you came back another day and it wasn't there anymore. Anything like that ever happen, or it just gets worse?
It only gets worse.
Only gets worse. Yeah. Okay. So, yet I think you will find it useful to be really observant and taking notes on things like this. You know, if a particular pest, if other than iguanas, I don't know what to do to control iguanas. We don't have that problem. We have other four-legged things, but not those. So you'll have to, there are probably many ways to prevent them or to remove them in some somewhat manner.
Having a cat.
A cat, yes, kill them off, something like that. But just to keep in mind that observing what's going on. When does some insect arrive in the cycle of the season, and do its numbers seem to be going up? And learn where to find them. What are their, as much as you can about their life cycle. You may be able to identify something as these are the baby stages, the young stages of a certain insect, because they all change as they grow from egg to adult, and they don't always look the same in half grown as they do fully grown. Of course, anything like a caterpillar or other larva forms, they never look like the adult. And in fact, you don't even know what kind of insect it is until it transforms to the adult stage. But many others do look a little bit like miniature versions of the adults. So things like grasshoppers, aphids, things called leaf hoppers, which is really important to you because it's the main reason why the virus that attacks papaya is distributed. If the virus doesn't distribute by itself, it is carried by these small insects that suck the juices from the plants. So the control then could be controlling those leaf hoppers. Unfortunately, that's not always easy. Okay, so what I'll do now is I'll start in on a few basic things about plants that getting damaged by pests or herbivores. It's not always true that it's a problem. So I'm going to start my my thing here, and I will then share the screen if I can find it. Yeah, I have to find and share the screen. Okay, there we go. Yeah. Okay, is this something you can see now?
Yeah, I can see it, Sam.
You can see it? Okay, plant herbivore interactions. So there's different kinds of herbivores, insects and vertebrates. So you've got insects, you've got iguanas, maybe other things. And then there's different ways that plants defend themselves. And those are using either what we call mechanical defense or chemical defense. And some plants can tolerate quite a lot of herbivory. It's not always difficult for them. So this just shows you some of the different types of insects that are important. Things like grasshoppers. Do you have those?
Yeah.
Yes? Hemiptera is another one. These are the things that are sucking juices, like we call them plant bugs or stink bugs. Mainly they are piercing the plant and sucking juices, and they can leave small scars. Homoptera, it's in a slightly different lettering. That is including the leaf hoppers and plant hoppers, usually quite small. They are also sucking juices from plants. Then the Coleoptera are the beetles. Mostly these are chewing as a larval form or as adults or both. They are chewing on the plants, or they, in the case of nuts and seeds, there are certain kinds of beetles that actually dig in and attack and eat the seeds. Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies, most of them, almost all of them, that are pests, would be butterflies or moths and have larvae that eat leaves. So this is one of the major sources of leaf damaging pests in many agricultural crops. Diptera are the flies. So we have fruit flies and various other kinds of flies that can, as the maggots, as the larvae, that's the stage at which they are damaging the crop or what's going to become the crop. Then there are Hymenoptera, so the bees, wasps, and ants, but relatively few of them are actually herbivorous and cause any problems. So that the column which says the number that are phyto, that means eating leaves, phytophagus. And so you can see in most cases, it's not all of them that eat plants, but a lot of them, like the grasshoppers and katydids and crickets, are almost all plant eaters. But something like the ants, bees, and wasps, only about 10% actually eat plants. Okay, so there's a bunch of different things that affect why plants get eaten. And this is important because when we're thinking of agricultural ecosystems, it's a very different from a natural ecosystem. This is a photo of a field of flowers that is in somewhere near here in Iowa. But there are plants that are big, often are more susceptible. That is, they're easy to find, they're large. So that's one effect that can be problematic. But small plants that are not so easy to find are attacked less often. The problem is in agriculture, you are making the plants really easy to find. But we have to do that. We have to plant a bunch of this one kind of plant here, one kind of plant there. And now they're not hiding in a mixture like this natural setting. Then and again, in the agricultural situation, insects can move around very easily. In the natural situation, there can be lots of barriers to their movement. And then another thing that's important is the timing of the stages at which the crop is vulnerable. So if this is like the time of growth, the peak growth period of the plant, you could have some insect pests that might attack it very early, like shown by the yellow line at the bottom, and that could be very damaging. So for example, if something attacks the very young seedlings, it can wipe out the whole crop even before you've had any chance to grow something. But if it's something that comes later, maybe when the crop is getting closer to maturity and these insects attack, they don't have as big an effect. They will take some leaf material off or something like that, but it's not necessarily going to be very damaging. So if the population size of a plant is low, that means it won't support very many of its herbivores. Again, in the situation of agriculture, you are making a large population of a particular kind of plant. So you're really setting up a salad bar. Everything will find it. Everything that wants to eat that will find it. And then you are increasing the density. So maybe we would never find in nature like a pure patch of some kind of cabbages or papaya plants or anything like that. They would be scattered around. And that means that the pest, the herbivore that wants to eat this, is going to have to look, and it won't find it as much. So all of these things, all of these factors of natural systems that make plants gain some protection, we take all of that apart in agriculture. So it doesn't, it makes the setting more difficult to manage. But that's just the way that we do it. Maybe there's another way, but to keep your life simple in growing something, you don't want to have to go and find the carrot here, find the carrot over there. You'd rather that they were all in one place. But also in nature, you find situations where what's growing near a plant affects how likely it is to be attacked by an herbivore. So if it's near some other plant that is toxic or strongly odor generating, something like that, that can provide some protection. And so we have traditions in many different agricultural areas of using strongly smelling plants as a kind of smell camouflage for the crop that we want. So we are never going to eat some strong smelling plant like a sage, a strong sage, or a marigold or something like this, but it will repel things that would have been eating our crop. At least it makes it harder for them to find, because most insects discover their food by smell. They can smell it in the air and they fly towards it. So the other thing, not all herbivory is damaging. You look at this leaf and you say, yeah, some of it's gone. But that's probably an insignificant amount of damage. That won't affect that tree that this leaf came from. This is a maple leaf, so if you've seen the flag of Canada, this is one. So it's really important in evaluating your situation. Do I need to control these pests or not? How much leaf damage is there? 5%, 10%? Probably not to worry. If it starts to go up past 15, 20, then it's a concern. But even a lot of studies have found as much as 30% defoliation doesn't affect the final growth of the plant or the yield of the plant. Now that's different if it's the leaves themselves that are the crop, and you often find people don't want to buy leaves that have already been partially eaten by some insects. So anyway, that's something to keep in mind depending on what the crop is. But even you can look around in your plantings and see that some plants of a particular species, I don't know what would be a good example. Some plants will be more attacked than others. And it might be interesting to ask why. It might be difficult to determine why, but it's clearly does happen that some individual plants get eaten more than other plants. So some may be relatively untouched, even next to another, but doesn't always take place. So when it does reach the point where the production of the desired part of the crop is being reduced, then we have an economic problem. Certain kinds of flower feeding is very destructive. If it's going to be fruits or seeds that is the crop, then anything that eats the flowers is of big concern, even though it's not necessarily eating very much. It's eating a critical stage. But plants have ways of fighting back, and that's one of the things we'll talk about briefly here. So a plant can be tough. It can be difficult to chew. We all probably experienced that. Some kind of plant we were trying to eat, it's a little bit tougher than we like. And there's a bunch of different ways that plants can increase the difficulty of being eaten, but by this simple, what we call mechanical defenses. But again, our modification for agricultural purposes, usually we don't want things that are tough. We want things that are easier for us to eat. So we don't prefer hard leaves and spiny leaves or anything of that nature. So we've probably a lot of plants that are occurring in the natural environment in the ABC Islands have a lot of thorns or spikes or something else. Yeah, very common.
Excuse me, you spoke about modifications.
Hello?
You spoke about modifications. What type do you mean?
A modification of the plant?
Yeah.
Okay, so most plants will have a particular type of way of increasing the difficulty of chewing them, but they can also respond to herbivory. So if some insects come and start chewing on those plants, the plants will respond by increasing the toughness. But mostly this is something that occurs as a sort of built-in property of a particular kind of plant. So, but something like lettuce obviously has very low toughness. That's why we like to eat it. The wild relatives of lettuce are very hard and also very bitter. Does that answer it?
Yes.
You there in the corner.
Thank you.
Sorry, my phone is texting. Okay. Then the chemical defenses. And these are really important.
You want to mute your phone, Sam?
Yeah, I don't know why this guy has to send me 5 messages for one thing, but I'll make it shut up. Okay. All right, so we call them secondary chemicals because they are things that the plant makes not for the business of being a plant, but for defense. So whenever you taste something really strong in a plant, you know, like culinary herbs and spices, all of these things, the plant is making them to prevent something from eating it. This, in some cases, backfires because we think this is great. I want to put that in my food. So the plant gets cultivated. So maybe that's a beneficial thing, but it's the qualities of herbs and spices are based on chemistry in the plant that is made for the purpose of defense. And you've probably encountered by now certain botanical pest control products that are utilizing those things as a spray to help prevent insects from eating that plant. So we find there's a whole bunch of different kinds. Alkaloids, you know, that includes things like the opium compounds. There's lots of them. Then there's what are called cyanogenic glycosides or mustard oil glycosides. So the mustard family, the cabbages, they all have this in relatively small amounts, so they don't bother us. But these release hydrogen cyanide, which is a deadly poison, or something else called isothiocyanate, which the latter is one of the things that gives mustard its characteristic flavor and aroma to us. But it's not toxic in modest doses for us. Lots of different plants have these. I'm just mentioning some of them. There are amino acids that are not usable in proteins. And so these are what they're metabolic poisons. And a lot of members of the peas, beans, and so forth contain these as defense. So we have to overcome those defenses, which we usually do by cooking them. Then there's other things like coumarins, which are quite common in the relatives of carrots. So carrots themselves, fennel, parsley, many other plants related to that. And these are also quite poisonous if they're ingested in large quantities. Then there's other kinds of defenses, terpenes and steroids. You know, we think of steroids as these guys in the gym, but there's also steroids in plants that are used as defenses. So some of them are antibacterial, so we get to use them as medicines. And they can be very small molecules like eucalyptus oil, and you can smell eucalyptus from a distance because that molecule is small enough to dissolve into the air. Catnip is just one of the many. Like pine trees, all the conifers have terpenes. All of these are strongly aromatic and or flavoring kind of agents if we like them, but they are also deterrents to insects. So why do plants do this? And it's how is it that different kinds of plants have different types of defense? So there are plants with a high reproductive rate, short-lived, fast growth, early maturation, and a high population turnover. That characterizes almost everything that we would grow in a garden setting. If it's a tree, it's going to be different. But for the short-lived plants, the annual plants that we grow, whether it's for vegetables, for grains, whatever it is, these are plants that live fast and die young if we leave them to their natural life cycle. But they grow relatively quickly, they produce what we want them to produce, and they don't generally have long lifespans. Now, on the other hand, a tree crop would be different, and it would be a long-lived plant, relatively slow growth. It might take several years to reach maturation where it starts to produce fruits or nuts. And these tend to have different types of defenses. The fast-growing ones, like our garden plants, they typically have toxin defenses. And the others have what we would call the terpenoids, steroids, and phenolic defenses. These are more general purpose. They don't they don't work against specific class of insects. They almost always work against all kinds of insects and also other herbivores, vertebrates like us. So when we talk about examples on this slide, like weedy annuals.
Sam, one question.
Okay, go ahead.
So the tannin defenses, those are the terpenoids and the you call terpenoids and phenols?
Yeah, phenols would be in the tannin type defense. So, and terpenoids would be a little different, but phenols are things like the browning reaction when you cut a potato or an apple. That is producing this kind of compound that serves as a defense against further injury of that fruit or potato, whatever. But it's like typically trees will have this type of defense. It sometimes happens particularly in tropical regions with very high diversity forests. You'll have the more specific type of toxin defenses that act to deter particular types of, they'll deter all herbivores with a few exceptions. Whereas these broad spectrum defenses like the tannins and phenolics and terpenes, those work against all herbivores, but not, they're not like acute, what we call acute toxicity. That is, it won't kill them, but they will not feel good after eating it. So typically they might take a little bite of one kind of tree, a little bite of another kind of tree, so they don't get loaded up with any one toxin or digestibility reducing material. So again, this is just to relate to what you're doing in a farming situation. You can just see why you're almost set up to have lots of pest problems. So then the question is, next, what are the pests doing? And this also has practical application, because a lot of the herbivores, like here is a picture of a cabbage butterfly, they not only smell the plant that they eat, in this case they lay their eggs on it and then their caterpillars eat the leaves, but that which they are smelling is the very defensive compound that the plant is making. But the butterfly has overcome that chemical defense. So it no longer works against the butterfly, but it does work against everything else that might try to eat the cabbage. And this is true for almost all plants that use a toxin type defense. It has effectively reduced the number of possible herbivores to a very few species. So the things that eat cabbages and members of the cabbage family only eat that because they can only detoxify the defenses of that kind of plant. So this is a little extra detail about what's called mixed function oxidases, which are enzymes that the insects use to break down the poisons and thus able to eat the plant. The problem for us is that they can quickly adapt to new defenses because they have already in them a set of techniques for detoxification. So that's why whenever we start off thinking we can use some kind of chemical control, the danger is there almost always that the insect overcomes that toxin, overcomes that chemical control that we apply. The plants have already reduced the number of possible herbivores for any one crop. Not everything can eat a cabbage, not everything can eat a papaya leaf, but there is something that can. There's almost always, there's no plant on this earth that is so poisonous that nothing can eat it. There are some plants that are extremely poisonous, but you will always find some insect or something has developed the ability to eat that. So no matter what you do in non-organic agriculture, which we don't want to do at all, it's going to fail in the long term.
I assume that's also the problem with GMO. They change the DNA so the plant itself becomes a pesticide, but after a while they see that they have other pests coming on the plant that they haven't focused on.
Yeah, so some of the GMO modifications have been to build a pesticide into the plant. And what that does, yeah, short-term gain, long-term pain, because you now have, instead of a few insects encountering this toxin, you now have huge numbers. And the power of large numbers is somewhere there will be some insect that has a natural variation that allows it to escape the effect of that toxin. That one will reproduce, and its babies will reproduce, and theirs will reproduce, and soon you will have an entire population of that pest insect that is able to overcome the toxin. That's how it works on spraying pesticides. There will always be one or two that make it. I think I even have something about that coming up. Let's go back. So when that, and another kind of thing that often happens is, remember earlier in this I said that when the plant populations are small, then there's typically not so much pest attacking them. When we make big plantations, large areas of a single plant, you can imagine thousands of hectares of sugarcane or thousands of hectares of something else. Now you have a huge feast for whatever pest of sugarcane happens to arrive there. And new pests come. So there are, insects can jump. I was saying, most of the time they are specialized on a certain type of plant. But because they often have very adaptable abilities to overcome toxins, it happens quite often that when a new crop comes into an area, so let's say sugarcane is a real life example. That's from South Asia. It was then taken all around the world and big plantations established all around the world. In the Caribbean islands, there was a huge sugarcane industry making molasses and rum. And in South America, it became a big thing, and Central America. And in all of these areas, new insect pests came. They were already existing in those areas, but they didn't eat sugarcane. Then some of them established populations that eat sugarcane. And suddenly there's 5, 10, 20 more new insect pests eating sugarcane that never ate it before. But now that there's huge fields of it, something jumped from an old plant that it used to eat to sugarcane. And this happens over and over again. Apples in North America had the same thing happen. Very large plantings of apples. Soon, pests that didn't exist in Europe, didn't exist anywhere else, but were already eating something in North America, they moved onto apples, and they developed new, what we would call races or even new species that evolved to eat apples, apple leaves, apple fruits, apple seeds. So again, this has happened with many different crop plants. So you establish a big area and something will start to utilize it. So all of these things point to a couple of possible solutions, one of which is maintaining higher diversity in crop plantings. Not having huge farms of all one thing, but many smaller patches of that particular crop. So this model applies very well to the horticultural crops that we'd like to grow for our own consumption. Okay, so what some of the things we can see also is that our plants that we like to eat, insects also like to eat. There's almost always a wild relative of that plant that's very difficult for us, but there are already insects adapted to eat it, and they would be quite pleased to find a less well-defended version in our garden. Okay, and then vertebrates are a different problem. Iguanas or monkeys or humans or deer or cows or goats, goats are famous for eating just about any kind of leaf that they can find, but they will not eat huge amounts of one kind that is going to poison them. They might touch a little bit. And even them, they will find plants that they will not touch. So it's so interesting that iguanas are a problem. Okay, so I should stop for a second if there's any questions about this part so far, because now I'm going to shift to one of the sources of biocontrol agents, then parasites. Anything else for now? Okay. Parasites. So
If we're at a natural stopping spot, we could take a quick break here, Sam.
okay, quick break is always a good idea. All right, does that sound good for the group? Quick break. Get up, stretch, recharge the beverages. Okay, let's go. So, as an introduction here, parasites are some of the best control agents that have been developed, where we're using an organism, a natural enemy of a pest to control it. There are companies that sell some of these organisms, they're almost always insects, that will attack only a particular type of pest insect and get rid of it, but not anything else. So we'll just go through a little background on parasites. And pathogens also. So is it a parasite or a pathogen? This kind of doesn't really matter. If it's something that's so small, like a germs, bacteria, fungus, we kind of think of it as something that causes disease. That's a pathogen. But if it's bigger, it's a parasite. But they're really doing the same kind of thing. So then we talk about macroparasites. These are big. They may be more like something that sucks blood or chews off a little bit of the skin, something like that. And then there's parasites that live inside. And then among those are what we call parasitoids. This is the most important category of biological control agents, where you have a specific targeted parasitoid that attacks some kind of insect that you want to get rid of. So they're called parasitoids because they go into the body of their prey, but they don't kill it right away. They live there for a while growing, and then they kill it. Most parasites don't kill the host. They want their food supply to continue living. So if you're unfortunate enough to have some intestinal parasite worms, they don't want to kill you. They just want to take some of your food. But God forbid that you should have a parasitoid, you're going to die. But there are no parasitoids that attack humans. In fact, there are no parasitoids, as far as I know, that attack anything with 4 legs. This is almost exclusively a problem for insects. And they get parasitized by other insects. So there's an example up on the top of us. These are usually, most commonly, members of the group of wasps, ants, bees, wasps. So the wasps, many of them most of the species of wasps are very tiny, 1 or 2 or 3 millimeters long as adults, or smaller. And many of them are parasitoids. So they lay their eggs in the eggs or the larvae of another insect. So in this case, it's a cabbage caterpillar. They'll eat their larvae of the wasp will live inside the caterpillar for a long time, for weeks, slowly growing, and then they go through a final growth spurt in which they take over the body of the caterpillar completely and eat it out. So that caterpillar does remain alive for a while. It does continue to feed, but it will never finish its life cycle. It will always die. So parasitoids there are probably millions of different kinds of parasitoids. Almost every insect has something that attacks it in this way. But they are also very unique. They only attack one host species of insect. So that is why people involved in biological control using parasitoids, they have to go out into the world and become explorers looking for the natural enemies of the pest insects. So there's a small industry of this for trained entomologists who can go out and find these things and then figure out how to get more of them. Now, parasites and hosts, there's always, like everything else, there's an arms race. Our systems are trying to resist the parasites, and the parasites are trying to overcome that resistance. So it's going to be happening, and we have plenty of cases where, in human populations or other vertebrates, there's been acquired resistance to parasite. And in the case of parasitoids, there has to be also a similar resistance, but it's not as common. It doesn't seem to be as easy to do. Okay, so a lot of different things about parasites tend to activate different defenses inside. The parasite has to overcome those. And just as an aside about human populations, this bottom paragraph, there's a growing body of evidence to support the hygiene hypothesis, which suggests that decreased exposure to microbes and helminths, so that's a kind of parasitic worms, in the industrialized country may impair the development of immune regulatory networks. So long story short is exposure to the dirt of nature to different types of plants in your environment, to different kinds of dust and so on at a young age is actually beneficial to our health in the long term. And it's because our bodies have this adaptation of how to fight off parasites. Our immune systems are really, they're looking for them, and if they're not there, they often start to attack parts of the body, and those are what we call autoimmune diseases. So thanks to the parasites for this. So almost all parasites have very high reproductive rates if they can find a host, but fortunately they mostly cannot. And they can be very important for control of some of the populations of animals and plants in the environment. And like malaria is a parasite. We know where we get that. It comes from mosquitoes. They are just the messengers bringing the malaria. And there are others, things like Chagas disease, yellow fever, dengue. These are all pretty much tropical diseases. They are transmitted to humans by insects. And these are parasitic attacks upon us. So there's really profound things going on in parts of the US with regard to some of the big animals and kinds of ticks, and there's parasites that go with them, but that's sort of not too important for you. But this is a sort of like parasites have their cycles and their host populations have their cycles. So they can go up and down, up and down, up and down. If the population of the host decreases dramatically, that means the parasite may go locally extinct. It would have to reestablish from some other area. So for the practical side, you don't ever want that to happen in your cultivation areas. You'd like to keep enough of everything around that the parasites can have a small population, and when they are needed, they will multiply. That is, when their host, when their target is present. One other thing I should mention is the production of nectar by lots of different flowers is one of the ways that you can encourage the parasitic wasps, or these parasitoid wasps, to be around. The adults don't eat the prey. They only will take a little nectar or something like that for some energy, and then they go around looking for places to lay their eggs. But they need an energy source, and so one reason for maintaining a diversity of flower sources of nectar or other sources of nectar. A lot of plants have nectar glands that are not in the flowers, but having nectar sources, having a diversity of flowers does a lot of different beneficial things. It can do smell camouflage for your crops. It can provide food for natural enemies. So that's one of the things that you're trying to recreate, the natural diversity and the natural functioning of an ecosystem as much as you can in and around your cultivated areas. So, and things are changing. So with the changing climate, the distributions of some of the parasites and disease transmission agents is changing. So you can expect in the years to come, some change could come to your region as well. But I hope not. You're already fairly warm, and you got the main thing you're concerned would be the shifting patterns of rainfall if something like that were to happen. But this just indicates that in North America, areas affected by some of the traditionally tropical diseases are going to start to spread. Okay, so now sort of with all this background on on how natural forces and natural conditions work and how we've modified to change those in agriculture. We've got some recommendations to sort of go over that. Okay, what's a pest? How do we control them? What are the pluses and minuses of using chemical controls, biological controls, and then what's called integrated pest management? So any kind of, I mean, weeds are pests in a sense. So we've got what we call ecological release, that is the absence of predators. So quite often in the simplification that we do to create a farm, we eliminate everything except what's in the soil. And then we start putting in plants. Now we're recreating an ecosystem, but it's a much simpler one. And the natural agents of predators and preys, that is gone. And now we get something else going, which typically shows up as things we don't want, weeds and insect pests eating our crops. But they have been released from their natural control by our act of creating a farm. But we still have to do that, so they've got plenty of food, they don't have their predators, there may be less competition, in the case particularly of things like weeds. And then some of these, and unfortunately, a lot of the globalization of biology means that a pest that originated in some other continent gets transported, usually accidentally, to some new place where it can continue its life as a pest. And so a lot of countries have rigid quarantine systems to prevent this, but it isn't perfect. It can still happen. Water hyacinth is a famous one that got loose from its original home in Brazil, and now it has become a pest clogging up canals and lakes. On the other hand, it can be very useful. It will grow really fast on wastewater. So in tropical areas, you can use this to purify wastewater, trap the nutrients in the plants, and then you can harvest out the plants and use it as compost. But there's an insect that controls it. So in Brazil, these little beetles manage to reduce water hyacinth so that it's not a pest. But almost everywhere else in the world that it lives, it is a pest. And then there's a kind of fly that attacks cattle, but they were around before, but they weren't a pest. But then people bring cattle, and these flies discover that they can live on cattle, and now they become a pest. So lots of different things. Traditionally, people used what are called polycultures or crop rotation. So you've, I'm sure, been exposed to both of these ideas. Crop rotation is where you have diversification in time. One crop follows another. That doesn't get followed by the same thing over and over again. The polyculture is where you have diversity right there. You have many different things growing in the same place at the same time. It's difficult in mechanically operated agriculture to do this, but on small scale farming, that's something a few human beings can manage. It is possible and can be very productive and a great way to reduce the need for pest control. So this goes way back, even ancient times, people, they knew that crop rotation was a useful thing to do. And it prevents the buildup of pests specific to that crop in the soil in the immediate area. So The other thing that helps a lot is to maintain the ecosystem services of diversity around the crop area. So I'm not sure how much of this you can accomplish where you are. It depends on how the immediate surroundings are. It could be urbanized or not having a lot of natural vegetation around it. But that's why we can often choose to plant things along the edges that will help reestablish diversity, reestablish food sources for natural enemies of pests, these kinds of things. Of course, cultivation and winnowing and removing of weeds, and then the introduction of predators and other biological control agents. Those are things that can be done and are often done. Herbal preparations, using things derived from plants as a way of getting rid of or preventing pests from taking over. So, but just to go away from organic agriculture for a second and take a look at how long has this been going on? So even in ancient times, the Romans and Sumerians used toxic metals. They used arsenic preparations and lead preparations as means of controlling pests. I mean, they didn't know that this was poisoning themselves, but they did it to get rid of insect pests. So then after the Second World War, the development of neurotoxic poisons for use as weapons. Fortunately, they were not used on humans, but they were developed. And then after that, there was this industry thing, oh, what do we do with all of this? And they discovered that many of these chemicals or similar ones can be used to kill insects. So then malaria control was actively being done during the war in tropical regions where it was almost the #1 cause of casualties in the military. Once you can eliminate the causative mosquitoes, then you had more soldiers who were capable of fighting. But after the war, you have this big chemical industry and it has to do something with its production capacity, or it wants to. And so then you get the development of tremendous amounts of pesticides and the birth of non-organic agriculture. So things like this is DDT, the famous molecule, banned almost everywhere in the world now, should be banned everywhere. And then others like organophosphates, like malathion, and carbamates.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What does it stand for, DDT?
Let's see. Diphenyl something
Theoretical something.
tetrachloride. So yeah, diphenyl, there's 2 phenols, and then there's something DDT. I'd have to look that up again. I used to be able to just recite these things. But this is what's called a chlorinated hydrocarbon. It's got chlorine atoms in between benzene rings.
So it stands for dichloro, diphenyl, trichloroethane.
Yikes,
I think that 10 times
trichloroethane.
fast.
Yeah, that's a mess. But all of these things are neurotoxins, reflecting their origins in the chemistry of killing people. That's why they are dangerous to use, dangerous to us, dangerous to everything else that has a nervous system. So any animal can be affected by these. Not all animals are. For example, organophosphates tend not to be very toxic to earthworms. That's not a reason to go out and start using organophosphate pesticides. But that's how it all got started. And now we are paying the price, and we have to go back to using more natural methods. Because there are a lot of bad side effects. So what makes a pest a pest? Lots of different things, all of the above, I would say. They're difficult to control. They are competing with us for resources, that is, the food that we want. And they may also cause diseases. So, ecological cost of pesticides. So we've got a fancy new tools to kill everything, but what happened? So quite often, the people manufacturing them knew that there were harmful side effects, but they didn't let it be known. 1962, that all changed. This woman, Rachel Carson, became very famous for bringing out the harmful effects of pesticides, particularly DDT. It caused birds' eggshells to be weak, so it was wiping out bird populations, even though no one was trying to kill birds. Then you get also the loss of natural predators. These are generally effective against all insects and therefore kills the natural predators of the pest as well as the pest. With the loss of natural predators, you then have a worse situation after the effects wear off and the pests recolonize the area that was sprayed. Then there's what's called evolved resistance. So the little cartoon is showing the red bug is resistant. You spray, and then you kill almost everything except the red one. Then another generation comes along, more red bugs, more resistant ones, and then you spray again, and now you've got almost all resistant insects. Now this can take many generations, 100 generations or 20 generations, I don't know, but pest insects can often have 2, 3, 4 generations per crop year. So they accumulate their generations very quickly. So that's how resistance evolves. It starts from a few individuals that just by chance have the ability to tolerate the pesticide. Those are the ones that survive and reproduce. And given enough time and enough exposure, every pesticide will get resistant varieties. This happens in plants. So there's weeds that are resistant to herbicides. There are insects that are resistant to insecticides. It just keeps happening over and over again. And because certain chemical categories act in the same way, you think, well, if DDT doesn't work, I'll switch to something else that's like it, Aldrin or Dieldrin or DDE or something, but it doesn't work either because it has the same mode of action as DDT. So that's cross-resistance. And then you can get multiple resistance. It may be resistant to one pesticide group, and then another pesticide group, and another. So you can find insects where they can resist most of the known pesticides that have been used to try and control them. So you end up you're on this ever increasing battle to control stuff. And then you can get what are called secondary outbreaks, which is where you start trying to control one pest, and you end up creating high populations of something else. So in Nicaragua, there were cases of this where the insect was, they were spraying to control pests on cotton, and they ended up generating a huge outbreak of a type of mosquito, Anopheles, which was a disease vector. So now suddenly they have to spray to kill the mosquitoes, which they never had to do before. Mosquitoes were present, just not at high numbers. So this is called the pesticide treadmill. Once you get going on it, you can't stop. It just, you have to go faster and faster and faster to stay in the same place. So we call that sometimes the Red Queen, after the Alice's in Wonderland story, where the Red Queen said, I just have to keep running faster and faster to stand still. So on the other side, resistance comes with a cost. Well, this is one thing that can save us, and this works for any organic control too. You know, herbal controls, any kind of control, you always run the risk of having evolved resistance. But resistance comes with a cost, and that is that the process of being resistant requires that the pest is expending some energy, some materials on being resistant. So if you had compared the resistant and the non-resistant insects in an environment without the pesticide, the non-resistant ones usually will do better. They are more likely to reproduce and reproduce more. Therefore, you get some hints as what to do to manage the evolution of resistance. Another reason that they can be less able to reproduce is some insects in their response to the toxin will rapidly pass material through their guts. Suppose it eats a leaf that has a sprayed on toxin, it then flushes out. It gets insect diarrhea. But that means they're not assimilating their food, so they're not gaining any benefit from it. Again, that's a cost of resistance. So they will need to eat more, and it will take them longer to develop. So when there's a cost of resistance, here is what you do. We talk about creating refuges in which the material is, the pesticide is not sprayed. And this works for the chemical pesticides, which you should not use because that would not be the organic way, and because they are toxic to you and to everything else around. And also for the organic controls. If it's a non-biological, something that gets sprayed on or applied in some other way as a dust or whatever, it's not a bad idea to establish a refuge. So in the refuge, you don't apply the material. So what you end up having then is where the pesticide is not applied, you have the resistant and the non-resistant both survive. So in this case, the blue ones are the resistant and the yellow ones are not resistant. So you apply the control agent, it kills all of the yellow ones but leaves the blue. If you continue to do that without a refuge, you'll eventually, in several generations, have only resistant insects, and now your control fails. You have to go find something else. But with the resistance being mixed with the non-resistant in the unsprayed area, you do maintain the genetics of non-resistance, and that helps dilute the effect of these every generation selecting for resistance. So it's a way of slowing down the evolution of resistance in an insect pest. Now, a lot of organic controls aren't quite as, they're not as drastic. They don't kill everything. They may simply slow them down or deter them from feeding. But it could still happen that evolved resistance will take place. So anything that's used in pest control, it's not a bad idea to consider leaving an area that you do not treat. It might be a hard thing to do. You know, you think I'm going to sacrifice that part of the crop. But I would look into that in relation to a question to ask. Is there any chance of evolving resistance to what it is that I'm using? If it's a parasitoid or something like that, an organism, no, you don't need to worry about that as much. But if it's even an herbal or botanical preparation that kills insects or deters them, that's something to consider. If it's some other thing you may be applying, like a compost tea that may elevate plants' natural resistance, no, keep going with that. You want the plant to be better defended. Okay, so here's some of the biocontrol stories that were very successful. This was from the citrus industry early in the history of large-scale citrus in the US. These scale insects, shown on the bottom left, are very destructive, but they are completely controlled by two types of natural enemies. One is this fly, it's a parasitoid, and the other is this beetle. Both the adults and the larvae of the beetle eat this scale insect. And these were discovered by extensive research in citrus growing areas, long established citrus areas, where the scale insect is present but not a pest. But in the USA, in California, for example, big citrus groves were established. There were no natural enemies of the scale insect there. So the scale insect arriving by accident encountered a universe of wonderful food and no predators, because the predators had been left behind. So it's a case of what we called ecological release. And so they became very abundant and very destructive. And it being in the 1880s, the chemical industry had not developed to the point of finding a poison. So the entomologists